Job chapters 32 to 37 today, and we've now finished the big conversation between Job and his three sort of friends who were a bit rubbish, and this new guy called Elihu just turns up. It's not clear where he's come from, why he's here, what business it is of his to lay his opinion and weigh in on this, but yeah, he just rocks up and he seems to be pretty miffed with everybody and decides he's going to put in his 2 pennies worth. It is a weird story in that respect, I mean, obviously. But it is made up, obviously, which kind of lets it off, I think, to some extent. So we've had Job has his 3 friends turn up. I'm sure I remember reading that they just sat in silence for a week, which is weird. And then finally, when they did speak, they just were criticising him the whole time and had this big old la-di-da argument. And now Elihu just turns up and, who are you, sorry? It's very odd. But in the context of a made-up story to illustrate something, I guess it's sort of okay. Elihu, anyway, is sort of annoyed because he takes it that what Job talking about, he is righteous in his own eyes. And, yeah, so in this respect, everyone's kind of given up on him because he can't be persuaded that he's wrong. But before Elihu gets started, he has this very weird bit of a speech where he's saying he didn't want to say anything because he's younger than Job and seemed to talk about age should speak wisdom and that sort of thing. And then he does this very long-winded, drawn-out kind of, I'm going to tell you what I think, I'm going to get to the point, and I'm not going to mess around while I do that. I'm just literally going to come straight out with it and tell you what I'm going to think. We're not going to have a meeting about it, we're not going to discuss it, we're just, here it is, and here it comes, get ready for it, here it comes. And it reminds me, there's some sketch somewhere, I'm sure there is, I can't think what it is. It's like Monty Python or something, like just getting to the point. Because this whole section is Elihu, so what, 6 pages or so? And a significant chunk of the beginning of this is his run-up to saying, I'm going to tell you something. Actually, it's an interesting idea as well, this whole idea that because someone's older, they must therefore be wiser. I distinctly remember being very much under that same impression when I was much younger. You just assume someone's older than you, they must be wiser, cleverer and more responsible than you. And that sort of point where you, I don't know what age it is, but you start to dawn on you that no, there are some really stupid older people and you can get some really bad advice from older people. But I sort of like that's alluded to in the Bible in that respect, even if it is in the context of a made-up story. Happily for this as well, the la-di-da-ness does come down a notch. He's still a little bit poetic, but less so than it has been. So Elihu starts off with talking about Job is wrong, because Job has mentioned previously that God doesn't speak. And Elihu says, no, he does speak, and says, though no one perceives, which is not very helpful. And then he talks about God speaks to people through dreams, which we've talked about before. It's just the most unreliable way ever to communicate with someone, isn't it? I was at a wedding yesterday, spent a whole day eating and drinking, and I'm not very good at drinking. Ending up at the end of the evening, pretty, I suppose pickled would be the right word, being a different thing to drunk. But, you know, you sort of get into bed and then you wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning and it's, oh dear, and very confused about what's going on. And some very weird dreams. But yeah, no matter what was in them, there is no way any of them is going to convince me to go and do something weird in the morning. So, yeah, it is a tricky one. It is actually addressed, of course, because we had much earlier on, I think maybe in Numbers, God saying that he speaks plainly to Moses because he's super duper and special, whereas everyone else he speaks to in dreams. So, you know, even the likes of Noah, told to build the ark, that was in a dream, wasn't it? So, yeah, it's, I mean, it doesn't particularly help, and it's not a particularly useful way to do that. Elihu also seems to suggest that everyone has some sort of guardian angel. I don't know if that's where that idea comes from. It doesn't sound like he's talking about this literally, some whacking great angel walking around with you. I don't know if it alludes more to the idea of the Genesis concept that Adam and Eve took from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, so we all understand intrinsically the knowledge of good and evil. Therefore, the guardian angel is basically that sense of right, and if we're going to do something, we do actually know. Or not necessarily at the time, I suppose, but mostly human beings know when they're doing stuff that's wrong. He seems to suggest that God doesn't punish, or God does punish the wicked, contrary to what Job says, and that this punishment does happen in life. That's another kind of difficult one, on the basis that it seems to be kind of, well, it's tempting to say it's not true, but I've often been caught saying things like, when someone does something, just, you get a moron on the road doing something, And there's a sense of injustice that they're doing that and getting away with it and terrorising people or whatever. And my feeling is kind of actually their crime is also their punishment. Whatever has driven them to behave like that is clearly a sort of demonic influence in their life to some extent. Demonic metaphorical, not demonic literal. So perhaps it could be something around that sort of idea maybe, but it's not a particularly satisfying punishment for those who are wronged by those. It doesn't feel like justice necessarily, especially if that muppet causes an accident and hurts you. There's also instances, of course, where good people have had bad things happen to them. For example, Christopher Hitchens, I suppose in theological terms, would be considered to have been a wicked man because he turned away from God and worshipped other things in whatever capacity that means in real life. And so people might be tempted to say, well, he died of cancer, so that was him being punished, and he was a wicked man, he wasn't allowed to get away with it in life. On face value, you think, okay, well, maybe, but you've then got, well, okay, Richard Dawkins, as far as I'm aware, and hope he is fine. And I know 2 vicars who've died of cancer as well, and no one's going to be able to say they're wicked, one of them even considerably younger than Christopher Hitchens when he died. So it doesn't really work, but the Bible does seem to want to have this idea of trying to point to stuff, saying, God did that because it's bad to a wicked person, or something good happens to a good person and God did that. It just doesn't translate very well to real life. So yeah, not quite sure what to do with that. Another interesting point from Elihu is he talks about God does not answer when people cry out because of the arrogance of the wicked. And you think, okay, there's a couple of ways you could look at that. On the one hand, I had an aunt who died not that long ago. One of the most wonderful human beings you can ever possibly imagine. So she was a Christian and a nurse, and very Christian and very nurse in the fullest sense of those words. And she died of pancreatic cancer, in quite a lot of pain, and I say quite quickly. I suppose that's perhaps a mercy in some respects. But in human terms, there is no way another human could make the case that she was in any way wicked. If you flip it though and look at it from the other angle, on the basis that all humans are wicked, there aren't any pure good humans in that respect, then we're all wicked, no matter how good we are. And yeah, so it sort of makes it a little bit meaningless, other than to suggest that God would then not answer anybody, surely, which, well, I think certainly some people think they have our prayers answered from God, but I don't know, like in my aunt's case, there was a very big WhatsApp group with lots of Christians on it, praying for my aunt, actively asking for a miracle that never happened. And yeah, I don't know. Is that part of a plan? It's just difficult to swallow the idea that, it's the same idea, I guess, isn't it? That bad things happening are not necessarily punishment for wicked deeds, surely. Maybe they are, but I don't know. There's that sort of, it brings you back to that sort of inconsistency idea that we've talked about before. It's a difficult one, albeit you've still got the atheist problem of looking at a situation going, well, if I was God, I wouldn't do that. But it's, of course, different level of thinking power, isn't it? So, yeah, I say a difficult one, but certainly an interesting one. There's also lots of talk about God controlling the weather. I guess this hasn't really aged so well, in that, 3,000 years ago, sure, weather would have probably looked quite random. And granted, there are limitations at forecasting the weather these days, but we do at least understand that there is a sort of a chain reaction thing. It's not just random stuff pops up. It's difficult to tell how it's going to plan out, but there is some causality to the weather. So I guess that bit hasn't aged really well. It's that same idea, isn't it, of ascribing actions and occurrences to God that don't really make much sense. I mean, granted, the weather today, God could be steering all of it. I'm not denying that. He could be behind. I don't think so. That doesn't, even if he existed, I don't think that seems very likely. Don't know. But, interesting ideas anyway. But yeah, so basically Elihu says that Job is wrong. He thinks he's sinless, but that's not true. And should basically stop whinging. So yeah, last bit next will be God turns up, and hopefully he's going to clarify some of this stuff for us.